Hello, everybody. Shalom. Peace be with you all. Welcome to the channel Universal God, Message of Peace. I'm Lale Tunser, this is Lee Wiseman, and today we have with us Simon Bell, who is an author and a retired psychologist and worked in psychiatry. And he's written this amazing book called Remembering the Holocaust and the Impact on Societies Today, amongst lots of other amazing books. And today he's going to tell us a little bit about this book, about himself, what made him want to write this book, and we're going to be discussing some of the lessons that we can learn from the Holocaust, and how it's relevant to our society today. So welcome, Simon. Thank you for joining us today, and please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the promotion as well. I was actually a mental health nurse. I wasn't a psychologist. My mental health career goes back to 1980, so well over 40 years ago. I was in that career for 35 years. For 22 years, I dealt solely with perpetrators and victims of crime, primarily perpetrators of crime. In my early days in psychiatry, I don't know about in the United States, but certainly in the UK, we still had institutions, old asylums, that had hundreds of patients in, probably half of whom were classed as long stay. These were people who had been in hospital for 10, 20, 30, 40 or more years, often elderly people who had been admitted as children, probably because they had learning disabilities and behavioural problems and couldn't be accommodated elsewhere in society. Most had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, whether it was deserved or not. They were horribly institutionalised, and the care we delivered was very much institutionalised care. And we didn't ask questions about their origins, their background, their life experiences. They were patients, they had a diagnosis, they were prescribed treatment, we administered the treatment, and we ran the institution in the ways that the institution dictated at that time. They were caring environments. There was no obvious cruelty, but in hindsight, it wasn't the kindest of environment. We meant well, but in hindsight, we could have done more. As my career progressed, I was dealing with offenders, and mental health, certainly in the UK, and I'm guessing elsewhere in the world, became more inquisitive, became more curious, became more questioning. It became an established norm, and is still an established norm, that at every assessment, a patient is asked about life experiences, particularly about experiences of trauma, and most notably, experiences of trauma in childhood. Excuse me. Whether that be neglect, emotional harm, physical harm, or sexual harm, we would ask about those experiences, particularly to find out whether those experiences had any bearing on the adult we were dealing with and their mental health problems. I found, dealing with offenders particularly, that I almost just needed to change the days, the dates, the times, the places, the people involved. The experiences were the same. Time after time after time, I met extremely damaged adults who had gone through hell in childhood, either at the hands of their parents or carers or the system in general. They had been dismissed by the system. They'd been labelled as having behavioural problems and conduct disorder. They'd been excluded from schools. They'd been expelled from schools. They'd been removed from family environments and placed in care. Always they had had negative labels, and no one at any point in their childhood has said, what's going on with this child? Why is this child presenting the way they are? It took for them to meet adult services, often after a career in the criminal justice system, often when they were tarnished by drug and alcohol dependence. It took that contact with mental health services for someone to be curious and to be inquisitive and to ask what's happened to you, rather than looking at the label they may have, either the criminal justice label or the psychiatric label of what's wrong with you. We started to ask, what's happened to you? What have you experienced? And we never sought to excuse, or I certainly never sought to excuse any offending behaviour, but I sought to understand. And if I could understand, I could explain. And if I could understand and explain, I may be able to get support in place that could affect change, that would improve the life of the person I was dealing with, but also reduce the harm that they cause society. If I could understand what had led them into drug and alcohol dependence and the crime that linked to that, I could better refer them into services to address their drug and alcohol dependence and psychological services that could address the psychological harm that had been caused by earlier life experiences. It worked. It was awful to hear those experiences, more awful for them to have lived them, but it made a difference. That caused me to reflect back constantly on those times years ago when I first worked in adult mental health services, when we had those long stay patients, many of whom had survived the Second World War. They'd either been combatants, they'd been pilots, they'd been soldiers, they'd been civilians who'd been caught up in it. We had a lot of long stay patients who were Eastern Europeans who'd been caught up in the true brutality of Nazi occupation. Some of them were Holocaust survivors. Not once did anyone ask, what's happened to this person? They had their diagnosis, schizophrenia. They had their medication, usually an injection once a month or tablets several times a day that caused horrible side effects. They were housed in this institution that controlled their behavior and daily activity. Not once did anyone ask, what's happened to this person? After I retired, I was lucky, Lee, that I could take early retirement for mental health care 8 years ago. And I did a master's degree in Second World War studies and the Holocaust. I found some research from Israel, excuse me, from the late 1980s, and it didn't look at a large number of patients, but it looked at a significant number who were classed as long stay patients in psychiatric hospitals in Israel, who all had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, had all survived the Holocaust, and they took them off their medication and reviewed their diagnosis. Not one patient had schizophrenia. They all had post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes, in Israel, of all countries that should be probably more Holocaust aware than anywhere else, these people had been housed in long-stay psychiatric institutions and had been given a psychiatric label that they didn't deserve. It was probably the easiest way to manage them in the 1960s and 70s and 80s when they manifested symptoms that appeared to fit a neat box to say, this person has got schizophrenia. The treatment for schizophrenia is this short-acting or this long-acting antipsychotic medication that will probably induce awful side effects as well, and we'll counteract those with other medication and we'll institutionalize them, but we won't ask what's happened to this person. It took until the late 80s for that diagnosis to be reviewed. How much better the care would have been for those people I looked after over 40 years ago if we'd been more questioning, if not only us as nurses on the front line, but the psychiatrists and the psychologists, the system in general, if it had been more questioning about what's happened to this person rather than what's wrong with them. I can't change the past, but my latter mental health nursing career, I could certainly change the way I behave professionally to be more curious and more inquisitive. I was a trainer for a number of years of encouraging colleagues across disciplines, not just in healthcare, to be curious and to be inquisitive, to ask questions, to ask about trauma experiences in childhood, particularly of abuse experiences, to improve the care that they deliver to patients. So that's one route where I came into the book. Another route goes back a long, long time. Lale, you're too young to remember. And I say that in the most respectful way. Lee, you may remember, or your beard may be adding a seniority that I'm wrongly attributing. Back in 1973 in the United States, there was a siege at a place in South Dakota called Wounded Knee. I don't know if you remember that, Lee.
I do.
At the time, I was in my early teens. In fact, I was 12 in 73. And I'd grown up on a diet, certainly in this country, of Saturday afternoon Westerns, a couple of times a week, Westerns on TV. You had the noble settlers, the heroic settlers ploughing their way across the West. You had the brutal, barbaric savages, the Native Americans, and you had the heroic cavalry who come riding in with a bugle blowing to rescue the settlers from these barbaric savages. That was the perception I had of Native Americans as a child. And then Wounded Knee happened at a place where there had been an awful massacre in the 1890s. It was the last brutal conflict of the wars between European powers and Native Americans. Terrible massacre. And Wounded Knee was suddenly back in the news again with this siege. I absorbed everything I could find about Wounded Knee. Every news article, any book I could get hold of, any scholarly thing I could find. And I was 12, 13 at the time, probably looking very strange to my peers. Why is he reading all this stuff? It suddenly gave humanity to these people I'd only ever seen depicted in films in a way that dehumanized them. So Native Americans to me have been dehumanized for years. They were the brutal savages that the noble Westerners had eradicated from the West. Suddenly, these were human beings fighting for a cause. It changed the way I thought about them. It caused me to inquire more and more about the conquest of the West and also about the behavior of European colonial powers elsewhere in the world, where the great British Empire. I had what we would call a secondary school education. So between the age of 11 and 16, I don't know how that would equate in the States, where in history, empire was glorified. The British Empire was a great and noble thing that had enriched the world. No mention was made of pilfering and pillage and brutality and enslavement. It was just this great, noble thing. So Wounded Knee caused me to question the history I was being taught about my own country. I was led to a wonderful book. I don't know if you've encountered it. It's probably over 50 years old now. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
I was just going to say that, and it was for me. It was also a very pivotal book. I recommend it. I made my daughter read it.
I read it again recently. It's still
amazing
valid.
Book. Everybody should read it.
Yeah, and that's changed my whole attitude towards other people, and caused me to be probably slightly odd as a teenager. But it led me into mental health care and wanting to make a difference, and ultimately, I'm sure it had an influence in how I became as a mental health nurse and how I've since been as a nurse. I returned to nursing for the pandemic because, what's a nurse meant to do when there's a global pandemic? But Wounded Knee, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the siege at Wounded Knee, the education that we were being indoctrinated with, I just became a very questioning individual. And then moving into mental health care and reflecting back on my early years later on, wondering what better care we could have given to people 40 years ago if we'd been questioning, if we tried to understand, if we hadn't just accepted a dismissive label of diagnoses rather than trying to understand the individual. We could have done so much more. And I hope that in the years since, as a nurse, I've managed to do more, but that my colleagues in the system I worked in have managed to do more. And I hope for society that we can do more, that we can be curious and inquisitive. When I wrote the book, and I will mention the book, the impetus in 2018, the Polish government introduced a piece of legislation. It's become known as the Holocaust law, that effectively criminalized anyone in Poland for saying or implying that Polish citizens were involved in the crimes of the Holocaust. Mm. The Holocaust occurred in Poland when it was an occupied and subjugated state. It ceased to function as a state. This is the narrative that the law gives. And any crimes that happened within what was once Polish territory during the period of occupation were Nazi crimes. They were German crimes. They weren't crimes that involved Poles. The evidence is that some, a minority probably, but some Poles were involved in the crimes of the Holocaust. They denounced Jews, they robbed Jews, they beat Jews, they abused Jews, they handed them over. Occasionally they killed Jews. There are some estimates that up to 200,000 Jews in Poland were killed by Poles. of the 2.5 million who died within that territory. It's the reality and the truth of Polish history. The law potentially seeks to deny history because the alternative narrative of all states that were occupied by the Nazis is one of noble resistors. We were occupied, we had no choice, we resisted where we were able. Poles certainly assisted Jews. There are more Poles than any other nation who've been recognized as righteous among nations by Yad Vashem. So certainly there were Poles who took inordinate risks to save and help their Jewish neighbors. But that law sought to potentially deny history, or certainly to adopt a revisionist approach of history. So not denying that the Holocaust took place, but taking a slant on it that modified it slightly to make it more palatable to a Polish audience. That caused me to research other nations that had been occupied, not all the nations, but France, the Netherlands, Ukraine and Hungary, which all experienced the Holocaust firsthand. In the Netherlands, this law-abiding, peaceable nation that has a wonderful reputation, almost of a nation of educated hippies, they handed over more Jews, a greater percentage of Jews than any other nation in Western Europe. 75% of the Jews in the Netherlands died. They were sent to Auschwitz and other camps. The Dutch people willingly cooperated with the Nazis more than the Nazis expected. The French, not all of France was occupied. Some of it was the Vichy region, the north was Nazi occupied, but north and south, they cooperated with the Nazis. Not all French, but some French. The French government, the Vichy government, enacted anti-Semitic laws way before the Nazis asked them to. They were on board before the Nazis asked them to be on board with anti-Jewish legislation. In Ukraine, Gentiles and Jews alike welcomed the Nazis when they moved in because they were getting rid of the Soviets. The Ukrainian people hated the Soviets. Only 9-10 years before, Ukraine had been hit by an awful famine, has been referred to as a Holodomor, which was instigated by Stalin and his regime. Probably 4 million plus Ukrainians starved to death. That regime, that famine was solely attributed to the Soviet Union, rightly so, and the Ukrainian people bore a grudge and hatred against the Soviets. The Germans understood this. And even though they were welcomed by all elements of society in Ukraine, the Germans used anti-Soviet propaganda to target Jews. The Bolshevism was actually Judeo-Bolshevism. It was a Jewish project. So if you hate the Soviets, you've got to hate the Jews as well. And Ukrainians happily took that on board. The slaughter of Jews in Ukraine was awful. In Hungary, there were anti-Jewish laws in Hungary way before the Nazis came to power in Germany. And whilst Hungary wasn't occupied until 1944, they were sending thousands of Jews into German occupied territory, and they were causing immense harm to Jews within the Hungarian territory. So across the occupied territory, citizens participated in, collaborated with, and cooperated with the Nazi regime. But I also thought, let's look at unoccupied territories. The British, we weren't occupied, the Channel Islands were. Channel Island legislators used Nazi race laws to identify Jews in the Channel Islands and send them over to occupied Europe. We were reluctant in this country to accept Jewish refugees because there was an awareness in government that to do so and to be open about it would help to foment the already present anti-Jewish feelings and sentiments within the country. So even though there was an awareness of what the Nazis were doing in Germany and doing elsewhere in Europe, the government here couldn't make the war anything to do with helping the Jews. It had to be all other causes, but don't help the Jews. When we took the kinder transport children, only 10,000 children over the whole period of the German Nazi regime. We only took 10,000 children, and then they had to be unaccompanied, and they were only taken on the understanding that it was temporary, that they will be returned to their country of origin once the risks have subsided. Most couldn't return to the country of origin because they had no families to return to. Their families had been slaughtered in the Holocaust. In the United States, and Lee, you will be aware of this, there was a pre-war, there was a lot of legislation to limit the number of migrants to the United States. Part of it was quite obviously anti-ruddy-skinned people. Northern white Europeans were more welcome than East Asians or Southern Europeans. So Mediterranean people less welcome than the Northern European. When it became known that the horrors were happening in Europe, there was a reluctance among some legislators in the States to accept Jews into America. And there was some of the language and rhetoric used then and in the UK. It's the same rhetoric and language used now in hostility towards migrants and refugees, and those who may be fleeing oppressive regimes and difficult circumstances. It's shocking for me, having done the research I've done and looking at it constantly, to see how it goes in a loop. The same sentiments, the same attitudes, different targets I've mentioned in the book. If you change Jew to refugee to asylum seeker to Muslim to Hispanic, the language is the same as the language of Goebbels. The ultimate aim may not be the same. It may not be genocide, but the hostility towards other people because they're perceived as being different or less worthy is the same. It causes me to constantly reflect on how do these attitudes gain prevalence? How do people see their fellow human beings as less worthy, as less deserving of rights and entitlements, as less deserving ultimately of life? A big part of it applies to the Nazi regime, any other modern genocide, be it Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, what's happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar, what's happening with the Uyghur in China, this sort of dehumanizing language. If you cease to perceive other people as being human and worthy of life, it becomes easy to accept harm against them and to cause harm to them. How we reach that point, propaganda, repeated messages, the acceptability of hate at a sort of lower level within the workplace through to a high level within popular media and elements of government in any country. If we dehumanize other people and that language becomes acceptable and normalized, it becomes easier to visit harm upon them or to accept harm against them. In the UK, I can mainly speak from a UK perspective, the attitude of some within this country to those who are fleeing Syria, Iraq, Somalia, other war-torn areas, particularly if they have the audacity to risk their lives by crossing the English Channel in a boat. The attitude towards them of some is horrific. When boats sink, it barely gets a mention in the press. It's quite shocking that you can have a boat sink with 80 people on board in the Mediterranean Sea. No living person is found alive. It'll barely get a mention. By comparison, I think it was about 2 years ago, one lone British tourist fell off a boat in the Mediterranean. That was wall-to-wall news for a couple of days until she was safely sound. One British tourist falls off a boat. It's worthy of news. 80 migrants die in the same sea. It barely gets a mention. They're human beings. They're our fellow human beings. It doesn't matter where they come from, what they look like, what faith they practice, what their first language is. They're our fellow human beings. And we need to find some way, either with religion, if religion is seen as the best tool for some, or without religion. We need to find some way to educate people to be more tolerant, to see the humanity in other people, to question the messages they're being given, to question the messengers, to challenge the language of hate. So that's been a big part of the theme of the book, is to look at history as it's been taught in the countries mentioned in the book, that narrative of history that has become socially acceptable, but also to try and learn the lessons where you can see how history repeats, how attitudes repeat, how harm is caused in similar ways, not necessarily in the same ways, but that ability to take life or to tolerate the taking of life or the ending of life or suffering becomes acceptable when it should be challenged. It should be grossly unacceptable to tolerate harm against other people because of where they're from or the faith they practice or the color of their skin or the language that they speak as a first language. We're all human beings. So that's a big part of the theme of the book. That's why I've written it, and that's why I'm here today.
Wow. It's remarkable. First of all, I just wanted to tell you, it was really amazing to hear from you about kind of institutional, kind of the institutionalization of traumatized people. You know, of course, in America, we had exactly the same. We had exactly the same system. Probably I'm going to say in the late 1970s, they did away with a lot of the institutions, and exactly the same thing happened. Everybody who they reevaluated these people, and they found that a lot of them were not just that they were traumatized, but they had become so institutionalized that they manifested the behaviors of their diagnoses, even though they were not. And interesting, I grew up around a lot of Holocaust survivors, and to be honest, we always knew they were weird. Right? I mean, they manifested a lot of really difficult behaviors. They're not, and of course, nobody knew about PTSD. And now that I look back at it, now that I look back at it and look at those experiences, I realize dealing with people who had experienced incredible trauma. A person who had lived my former one of my former employers, he lived in a ditch for 2 years. I mean, lived in a hole for 2 years. I mean, how are you going to be if you live in a hole for 2 years? And this dehumanization, I used to think of propaganda as being something which was just, as something which was so obvious, right? It was so obvious and so crude. And then I realized it's really not so crude. It's very subtle. A few years ago, somebody sent me an article, and they said, "Who do you think this article is about?" And I'm kind of reading it, and it's talking about, these immigrants who live in these, I forget what, it was describing these buildings as kind of, rabbit warrens or rats' nests or some kind of parasitic language. And I said, I don't know. I said, I have no idea who it's about. It could be about Syrians in Germany. It could be about Algerians in France. It could be about Pakistanis, right, or Afghans in London, or and they said, and I said, I have no idea, and they said, no, it's about Jews. It's about Jews in New York, in 1918,
Yeah.
right? And I realize it's the same language recycled over and over again. That is really, as you say, a language of dehumanization that allows us to be able to see people, right, as less than. And in spite of Enlightenment values, I mean, that's the
Yeah.
you took about the Netherlands, right? I mean, a very enlightened society, right? And Germany itself, right? A very enlightened society in many ways, and yet, and the Enlightenment, has nothing to do with it. This is something which is so fundamental, and so so you certainly identified the problem. Do you have where do we begin for a solution?
I don't know. We have to look at the past, I think, to try and learn lessons. You say about Germany, I remember reading there were less than, I think it was only just over 500,000 Jews in Germany when the Nazis came to power. They were less than 1% of the population. Most Jews in Germany would be classed as assimilated.
Right.
Unless you were told, you wouldn't know they were Jewish.
Right.
Quite often, Christmas would have
Christmas trees, right?
celebrating
Yeah.
Hanukkah and a Christmas
Yeah.
tree,
Yeah.
and buying and sharing Christmas presents. There was nothing discernibly different about the Jewish population
Right.
of Germany. There had been a bit of an influx of Eastern European
Right.
Jews, Ostjuden they called them,
Yeah.
and there was some hostility towards them, including from German Jews,
Right.
because
Yes, yes.
these new people we're not expecting. But most people in Germany had no reason to hate Jews, and yet they bought into the propaganda. And ultimately, they bought into it to the degree where they could tolerate either Jews being killed in front of them or being transported to camps, mainly in the East, where they'd be slaughtered. And they will have known what's going on because people in the East were sending letters, they were sending photographs, they were coming home on leave. That tiny population of German Jews were demonized by the majority population, despite having no obvious reason to hate them. You mentioned about institutionalized people. As an example, and you will have had similar in the States. There used to be an awful diagnosis used in mental health, and I caught people who've been in hospital for 30, 40 years who are now moderately old women. To my younger self, they seemed old. They may not have been that old, who had been detained in hospital as moral defectives. They'd had a child when they weren't married. I met them 30, 40 years later when they were horrendously institutionalized. They'd become psychiatric patients
Right.
because they'd had a child. But I suppose it goes back to your question. I can look at that and go, no, that would never happen again. But I'm sure there are similar attitudes towards people whose behavior is deemed to be immoral in some way,
Right.
in some arbitrary way that someone will cast judgment on
Right.
someone's morality. So we can look back at these people who were detained in hospital for years for moral reasons, which was wrong. And we can look at attitudes to people who are judged today for moral reasons that may be wrong, where someone is imposing their morality on someone. We have it where morality is used as a judgment for people's sexuality or how they perceive their gender. Who are we to judge someone's sexuality and perception of gender? Surely they're human beings, and we should treat them with the same love and respect that we would expect to be treated ourselves. But there is that moral code that societies have got. Some societies more brutal than others. There are some societies where sexuality can lead to vicious punishments and death still.
There's something, as you said, the Germany is a really good example, in the sense that, so the German Jewish community, as you said, right, was probably the most assimilated Jewish community in the world. And with, of course, there were, of course, Eastern European immigrants who had come, but the German Jewish community was certainly very, I mean, I have a friend who's German Jewish who has a Christmas tree, has Christmas tree ornaments, that already come from the early 1800s. So by the early 1800s, they were very assimilated. They said Berlin is the new Jerusalem. I mean, they were very, very assimilated. And so it feels there's a kind of arbitrariness, I lived in India. And caste, of course, is also is a system kind of built around some of these ideas. And a friend of mine was talking about another guy, and he said, "Oh, he's a member of this caste, I'm a member of this." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, okay, you sound the same to me. You have exactly the same accent. You're from the same place." And I said, "What's the difference between you?" And he looked at me and he said, "My mustache." I said, "What?" He says, "My mustache goes down. His mustache goes up." And I said, "So?" He says, he looked at me as if that made all the difference in the world. There's something so, there's, the arbitrariness of this, whether it's based on religion, whether it's based on language, it, the difference between an Armenian and Azerbaijani, right, in terms of culture is relatively little. There's a difference in the difference of religion, but they share a common culture and a common geography. But it's Uh, do you think, is there something like built inside of us biologically that kind of makes us suspicious of the other, that we're always looking for the other? And even
I,
if
I,
they're just like us, they must really be different from us because their mustaches up, their mustaches down.
I'm convinced a lot of it is indoctrination. That it's how we're educated. It's the influences we have in life. You could go to some basic biology, and some elements of this have been questioned. With the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
Your amygdala is your basic reptilian element of your brain. So first time you hear a loud bang, amygdala will tell you to jump. Second time you hear a loud bang, if you know it's a firework or someone bursting a balloon for fun, you'll laugh. Your prefrontal cortex has taken over, it's rationalized it. And I think there's an element with the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex where it requires education, it requires familiarity. That if you're taught and raised to believe that something is a threat, whether it's a person, a people, an animal, and an environment, and nothing counteracts that to rationalize it, then that becomes so. There was some research done, and I can't cite the source for you now, where they did, I think it was MRI scans on avowed racists and showed them a series of images, and they might be benign images, fruit, bananas, apples, pieces of furniture, very, very benign images, through to people who appear to be within certain roles, so doctors or other favourable ones. And then they showed images of those that these racists hated within the group that they hated. And they found that the response within the brain to the bananas and fruit was no different from the response to those that they hated, that their brain wasn't perceiving the hate group as anything more worthy than pieces of fruit, but there was a favourable response to the doctor, the teacher, the person who society viewed well. I can't give you the source right now, but it was a fascinating piece of research.
So that's strange. Then where is it happening? Then where's the judgment happening that if you're Han Chinese and you're seeing a Uyghur, that this is a thing to be feared, or a thing to be angry at, or a thing to
I think it's a drip feed of messages. It doesn't have to be overt hatred, just a drip feed of messages.
And I think it's sorry, go on. No, sorry.
If you've got that drip feed of messages, they gradually take root within the brain. I was talking to a colleague recently who was bemoaning the fact that her parents were racist, and she rationalized it. But of course, it's their generation. I said, I'm not buying that. He said, why not? I said, because I was raised in the 1960s and 1970s, when casual racism was the norm. You would have comedians on television who would speak the most awful racist jokes, and I won't use the words they use, but they denigrated various members of our community based on their country of origin or the color of their skin. That was the norm. I grew up in a society where jokes amongst my peers were primarily racist. Racism was everywhere. My parents were good people, but my mum, though she would never have openly admitted it, was quite racist. She had a vivid memory of a road in Lancashire in the north of England during the Second World War, of walking along the road with a mum and being made to walk down the middle of the road and look straight ahead. Whatever you do, don't look left or right. And the reason being, there were black GIs marching down either side of the road. Don't look at them, don't look at them. So I was raised within a racist environment where racism was the norm. When my colleague said to me, it's her generation in reference to her mum. No, it isn't. Generational is an excuse. If it's generational, me, my family, my children would all be racist because I would have fed that to my children, and I haven't because I'm not racist. I'll challenge racism, I'll challenge hate. So I think a lot of it is education, and it's that quiet normalizing of hate, whether it's from higher levels of government, whether it's from elements of the popular press, whether it's print media or television media, whether it's social media, or whether it's just peer pressure. You know, what becomes normal within a work environment, within a social environment. If it becomes normalized, it becomes easy to hate and dismiss and to dehumanize. And the ultimate dehumanizing is the language of genocide, of referring to others as cockroaches, as rats, as infestations, as invasions, you know, as cancers, as plagues upon society, to generalize whole other people. If you dehumanize, then, as the Nazis showed and those who supported them showed, it's easy to kill them. If you don't perceive someone as a human being, it's easy to kill them. When the Tutsis were slaughtered in Rwanda, they were referred to as cockroaches. There were the radio messages of it's time to cut down the tall trees. It became easy for the Hutus who participated in genocide there to kill them. In Cambodia, the intelligentsia were easy targets because they were seen as, you know, lazy sponges off the hard work of society. It became easy to harm them. In Bosnia, the killing of Muslims there became easy because they were demonized, even though these were people who'd shared that society for hundreds of years. I think it's propaganda and education, and we as human beings have a duty, you know, and everyone that we associate with has a duty to educate, to challenge, and we can challenge without being abrupt. We can challenge without being rude. We can challenge. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that? The racist joke. Sorry, I don't get it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Make people think about what they say, and you know, get them to rationalize what they say to truly explain it. And most can't when you put them on the spot.
Yes, very well. Very well, very well said, Simon. I think I agree with you. It's, you know, when we educate our children in a certain way or because of our own beliefs and culture, we sort of, you know, our children pick up on that. But I think the more we encourage our children to seek truth and to even challenge us and everybody around us, you know, we all have to seek truth. I think that's it. Like when we stop questioning, then we become more willing to accept you know, other people's opinions and beliefs as truth. And that can be quite dangerous. Also, obviously, sometimes fear is used as a weapon, as a tool to prevent people from speaking up the truth. So it's all about truth, really, speaking truth, seeking truth, and you know, living our lives in a way that we treat others with the same respect for life that we would want to be treated with, and not doing unto others what we wouldn't want done to us. And actually, a lot of people who have, you know, who become criminals or engaged in antisocial behaviors, we find that, you know, when we explore their background, they've had similar things done to them. And it's easy to obviously it's important to understand that because it's human nature really to think that that's okay and to do it to other people because it was done to you. But actually, the more society encourages us to reflect on our past, reflect on our negative experiences, to gain wisdom from that, and the wisdom might only be, despite the pain and the suffering, that I really didn't like that this was done to me. And therefore, I am now not going to do that to somebody else. And if that's what we can learn from our negative experience, then I think that is an amazing thing. But it's a painful thing to go through. It's a painful thing to reflect on your past. And so many of us, you know, we turn to alcohol, we turn to drugs, we turn to things to distract ourselves from post-traumatic, you know, we don't want to remember these things. And we just sort of engage in distracting things in the world. But actually, it is important to try to remember. And the more we can show compassion for each other, to enable each, you know, if we're there for each other and we show compassion for each other, then people might actually feel like they can open up about their past. They might feel like they are loved and their story is important, that they can share and people will empathize and listen to them and learn from them. because those people who have experienced these traumatic things, they have the power to make so much difference if only we would listen to them and learn really. I mean, we don't know if unless we've been through something ourselves, we don't really truly know what it can be like. We can imagine what it might have been like, but there are still many lessons we can learn from it. And I think it doesn't help as well, ignorance. There's so many people in the world today who, and always have been, I guess, who do bad things in the name of religion. And and then what happens is that we then get hate crimes against people of that religion who are very innocent, you know. So there might be a few people who call themselves, you know, a Muslim and, you know, go around chopping people's heads off and killing innocent people. Although, you know, whatever their label, you know, they might call themselves Jewish or Christian or whatever, and do these awful crimes. And then we get hate crimes against the innocent Muslims, the innocent Jews, the innocent Christians, the innocent of all of these groups under this label. They then get attacked because people just assume that a whole group of people are responsible for the actions of a few. And so I think obviously, why do these few use that label to do these bad things? I think either probably ignorance or arrogance, because all of the major religions, they teach peace, they teach compassion, they teach kindness, they teach respect for life. They, you know, you cannot murder, you cannot, you know, lie, you should not steal. All of these things. So actually, you know, we all need to educate ourselves about the teachings of these religions. We all need to educate ourselves and actually, you know, because it gives God a bad name, it gives religion a bad name. And then people lose faith in God. They lose faith and they lose hope. They lose hope in humanity and altruism and kindness and compassion because of this. So I really hope and pray that, you know, more Muslims will stand up against the actions of Hamas, what they did on October the 7th. I, as a Muslim, you know, condemn it. And I hope the same can happen with, you know, I don't want to talk about it really, but you know, what's happening in Israel. Let's not attack innocent Jews because of what's happening with the political situation in Israel, because it's let's not class and and hurt a group of people with a certain label just because of the actions of a few who use that label to do bad things. Okay. Instead, let's look at what does the book say? You know, look at the Bible, look at the Quran, read, let's learn from each other, and let's seek truth in honest conversation. I think that's what I would advise, and let's try to be good role models for other people, as much as we can. And we're going to be talking after this about empathy because obviously, you know, empathy is very, very important, and hatred is often the cause of all of this type of thing, and arrogance.
I have a sort of inspiring story. My you know my grandmother, you know, my grandmother came from Eastern Europe. She's from Romania, and she was probably a pretty scared girl, I would guess. You know, coming to America, she was very young. She didn't speak any English. She ended up in New York in the ghettos in the ghettos in New York, and she did sewing, piecework, whatever. Um, and she was terrified of Black people. My grandmother was terrified of Black people, and she would refer, you know, and while she was extremely kind, she was like an overwhelmingly kind human being. She just was terrified of Black people, and she referred to them as the chayas, wild animals, and that was, and she got to be very old, and she was very old. She was in her 80s, My grandfather was very ill. He had Alzheimer's, and he was in a place just down the street from her. And his nurse, one of his nurses, was a West Indian lady named Trudy. And this lady, for whatever reason, just loved my grandmother. She just loved my grandmother. My grandmother had gone almost blind. Okay, she had gone almost blind. She could only see like a little pin. And this woman would come and talk to her every day, and she would sit with her, and and she became very friendly with this woman. And one day she looks over and she sees through her pinhole vision that she's black, which she never knew before, right? She has a West Indian accent. My grandmother had no idea what a West Indian accent was. And all of a sudden, she realizes that this woman who she's come to really love is black. And so my grandmother talks to me about it, and she said, I've been so stupid. She said, I said, my whole life I was afraid of black people. And says, and I said, now I have a black daughter, and now I have this black daughter. And I love her. I love her so much. I can't believe I was like afraid of these people. Like, what was wrong with me? Because my mother, she was like 86 years old, and she's like, I like so stupid. She was stupid. And when my grandmother passed away, she I almost started to cry. She sat Shiva with my family. She's for the 7 days she went into mourning with my family, and she's been a part of my family ever since. Um, and so it these little human interactions, I think one of the things that's beautiful about the internet and about this experience even, right, is the ability for people from other places in the world to talk to each other, you know, and to see each other and to see each other as human beings, when we cry together, we laugh together, we can see each other as, you're sitting in my living room, right? And here in America, right? You see
Yeah,
my stuff. You see my stuff, right? It looks like your stuff, right? And he says, as a human being, okay, he's a Jewish guy. He looks like an extra from Fiddler on the Roof, but he's a normal guy who's got tables and chairs and
yeah.
uh, and I think that we're in an era now where we can humanize each other so much more easily, you know. We have great opportunities now, I think.
I think it's trying to nurture familiarity. If we're familiar with those that we would perceive the other, if we just get to know people in work, in schools, in day-to-day life, and
Yeah,
see the person rather than what you may have perceived as a difference.
right.
Just the person. And people are people.
Yeah,
Yeah. People are funny. People are not so funny. People
yeah,
are serious. People are not so serious.
yeah.
People whose company you love. People whose company, well, maybe
So
not
much.
today. But it's just humanity. That's the nature of humanity. Seeing people as people rather than trying to seek those differences and target those differences as a reason to hate. And we're all capable of that. I think for me, one of the downsides of this sort of forum, and this is respect to me as well, is we're almost preaching to the converted, that this will largely reach people who are of a similar mindset. And we need to reach beyond us. We need to encourage that familiarity with others beyond us. We need to encourage that tolerance beyond us. We
Yeah,
need to encourage that questioning beyond us. How we do that, I'm not sure, but we can do it, I'm sure.
yeah.
Oh, so beautiful. Thank you so, so much, Simon. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sure Lee Wiseman will agree with me that
I
honestly
do.
that was amazing. Thank you so, so much. And for all those who are watching, you want to buy this book, Remembering the Holocaust, and the impacts on society. I've had a look at it and it's amazing, really well written, and so much it's so inspiring, and there's so much we can learn um from this book. And I'm sure from other books that Simon has written. And thank you so, so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us today, Simon. God bless you. And
Thank you for having me.
thank you very much. Peace be
My
with you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.